Akahai lokahi olu olu ha'a ha'a aho nui. Akahai na Hawai'i lokahi akulike olu olu kamana'o ha'a ha'a ko kulana aho nui a lanakila. Aloha mai na Hawai'i, ke aloha no ka mea nui. E o mai na Hawai'i, na pua, na le, na mamo. Ala mai e ka lahui, laula kaulana. O mai ka lehu lehu, ha'aheo oi e Hawai'i. Anawai me ke aloha, aloha ye. Aloha, ye. Aloha, ye.
Heoli aloha, a chant that expresses the meaning of aloha. It calls upon us to treat each other with kindness, with humility and respect. It also beckons the lahui, the nation, so that we might collectively rise and answer this call of aloha. Velina mai, welcome. A most warm mahalo nui to Melody Kapili Aloha Mackenzie for beginning us on our journey of what will truly be a memorable evening. I am Noelle Kahanu of the American Studies Department here, and am humbled by this opportunity to serve as tonight's MC as we gather to listen to the Spring 2016 Dan and Maggie Inouye Distinguished Chair in Democratic Ideals. Please welcome to the stage Chancellor of the University of Hawai'i at Manoa, Robert Blave Roman, as he shares some additional opening remarks.
Aloha kākou. This evening is what makes my job worthwhile. It is events like this that are what a university is about. And in particular, this evening is about what the University of Hawai'i at Manoa is about. This evening's presentation is part of the program of the Daniel K. and Maggie Inouye Chair in Democratic Ideals. The Chair in Democratic Ideals engages scholars and public figures dedicated to sharing their knowledges and experiences. Established in 2005, it's held jointly in the William S. Richardson School of Law and in the Department of American Studies. This visiting faculty position emphasizes democratic processes and the importance of public life while enhancing understanding of the unique context of Hawaii, Asia, and the Pacific within the traditional positions of power and influence in the United States. The Dan and Maggie Inouye Distinguished Chair honors two distinguished UH alumni who have shaped America. The late Daniel Inouye himself was a 1950 graduate, American war hero, longtime senior senator from the state of Hawaii, and champion of progressive change. His late wife, Maggie, was a 1946 graduate of the University of Hawaii and an educator who was dedicated to the people of Hawaii and who played a key role in her husband's achievements. So today we not only celebrate the university, our guest, but also Daniel K. and Maggie Inouye for their accomplishments and leadership. So welcome to the Daniel K. and Maggie Inouye Chair Lecture this evening.
Okay, we're going to get started with an introduction by Robert Perkinson, and he is a faculty member of the American Studies Department. Please welcome him for an introduction of our chair.
Aloha. It is my honor to introduce a speaker who has been introduced in so many ways before. Once by President Nixon, who branded her a dangerous terrorist. Once by Ronald Reagan, who had her removed from her philosophy position not once, but twice. Once by Yoko Ono and John Lennon, even by the Rolling Stones, who wrote songs about her. Once by James Baldwin, who penned a eulogy for her when she was in prison in California, facing the gas chamber, in which he vowed to fight for her life as if for his own. In that time, in the twilight of the 60s, as conservatism was ascendant and collided with freedom movements still on fire, Angela Davis became a political and cultural icon. She could have been frozen in that moment in time. Instead, she thought and wrote and spoke and struggled forward. As an academic, Professor Davis has produced a bookshelf of texts influencing fields from American studies to philosophy to ethnomusicology. She has helped found whole intellectual and political movements, third wave feminism, what has become known as intersectionality, critical prison studies. As an activist, Angela Davis has fought for freedom from repression, but also more substantive freedoms, for dignity, resources, opportunity, freedom to thrive, freedom to live. She has spotlighted throughout her life those least in favor. In the Cold War, in Cold War America, she became a communist. She fought for prisoners when law and order was becoming hegemonic. She fought for LBGT justice early. She fights for Palestine still. On many visits to these islands, in which she befriended Haunani K. Trask and many of you in the audience tonight, she has spoken out for the Hawaiian nation. Her words, her messages are as vital today as they were at any time. Since the 1960s, of course, we have seen amazing movement victories. Disability access, environmental protections, albeit insufficient, doors to closets flown open, the selection of a Black president. But the structures of violence and injustice that Professor Davis decried at the start of her career, even as a youth in segregated Alabama, remain. Jim Crow may have perished, but America remains separate and unequal. Unions and the Great Society, institutions that mitigated poverty and solidified the middle class, have been torn asunder. Wealth has flown upwards. What she calls the prison industrial complex is 10 times larger today than it was when she was in its clutches. War remains a governing logic of American politics. Demagoguery, racist demagoguery, once banished from polite company in America, has returned to presidential politics. We might find all of this disheartening, but I believe, at least to some extent, that Professor Davis does not. Because, as the title of her talk this evening suggests, she has lived freedom as a constant struggle. She has said that we must act as if the world can be radically transformed, even if sometimes it seems that it cannot. She once said that revolution is a lifetime commitment, and more, a commitment to build a better world for children yet unborn. And so, with hopes that we might see glimmers of that world tonight, I give you Angela Davis.
Thank you and aloha. Let me tell you what an honor it is to be able to spend the next few weeks on the campus of the University of Hawai'i, Manoa, as the Dan and Maggie Inouye Distinguished Chair of Democratic Ideals. I feel especially privileged to follow such chairholders as Frederick Wiseman, who was the director of the film Titicut Follies, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is the brilliant Kenyan writer, and John Hope Franklin, the activist historian, the author of the monumental work From Slavery to Freedom. And so I thank the Chancellor, Robert Blay Roman, the Department of American Studies, the Law School, the William J. Richardson Law School, Noel Kahanu, Professor Robert Perkinson, and all of the amazing graduate students from American Studies, the Law School, Women's Studies, Political Science, Sociology, English, and Social Work, who enrolled in the seminar I am currently teaching with Professor Perkinson. Although this is the first time I will have had the opportunity to spend an extended period here in Hawaii, I have visited at least once a decade since the late 1970s. During my first visit to this university, I had the opportunity to meet Mari Matsuda, who of course is now a professor in the law school, but she was still a student at the time. I was invited later to speak at the university by Professor Haunani K. Trask, and had the opportunity to witness the completion of the buildings for the Center for Hawaiian Studies. And I should also say that some of my former students are on this campus. I had the opportunity to teach political science Professor Noelani Goodyear Kawapua when she was a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz. And just a few hours ago, I learned that Njoroge is in the history department, and I taught him as an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz. So all of this is to say that I feel I have substantial connections with this place. The theme of my talk comes from the title of my latest book, which bears the name of a freedom song from the mid-20th century Black freedom movement. Freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we've struggled so long, we must be free. We must be free. The other verses evoke crying and sorrow and moaning and dying. They say that freedom is a constant dying. We've died so long, we must be free. I like the irony of the last line of each of the verses. We've struggled so long, we've cried so long, we've sorrowed so long, we've moaned so long, we've died so long, we must be free. There is both critique and inspiration here. We must be free. We must be free. But are we really free? This song was designed to forge community. Freedom emerges from the very process of struggling. And as we attempt to achieve freedom, we discover many new dimensions of the freedom we thought we knew. We transform our sorrow into joy, our pain into pleasure. The very first time I visited Hawaii, the struggle to force the Navy to leave the sacred island of Kaho'olawe had just erupted. And I had the opportunity to meet with quite a number of the activists at that time. There was struggle, there was sorrow, there was moaning, and there was dying. Today, the island is no longer controlled by the military. No longer controlled by the military. But freedom is a constant struggle, and the struggle against militarization continues. The struggle here in Hawaii against militarization, the struggle to preserve agricultural lands, the struggle to save this beautiful place in the world from Monsanto. The struggle to protect Mauna Kea, and the struggle against police violence. Of course, people around the world know the names of Mike Brown and Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old who was killed in Cleveland. But we should also include Colin Elders, the young Kanaka Maoli who was shot and killed by a federal agent some years ago. Freedom is a constant struggle. Every time I have visited Hawaii, there have been reasons to evoke the constant struggle against racism. During the late 1990s, when I was here, John Hope Franklin, whom, as I mentioned before, was one of the holders of the Dan and Maggie Inouye Distinguished Chair, he had tried his best to spark what was called then a national conversation on race under the auspices of the Clinton administration. The other Clinton administration. And you may have noticed that today Clinton is trying to defend his crime bill, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. And perhaps we can talk about that later, but I want to bring up another aspect of his presidency. In 1997, Bill Clinton announced that he was about to, quote, lead the American people in a great and unprecedented conversation about race. Now, people who had followed Clinton's nomination of Lani Guinier to head the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and who were aware of his subsequent withdrawal of the nomination, because apparently she was considered to be too radical for that position. They knew that it was actually Lani Guinier who had initially proposed a national conversation on race. She had said, and I quote, "We need new thinking and new approaches to race and racism that move beyond notions of intentional acts of bigotry and prejudice, beyond the claims of legal racial equality that rallied the civil rights movement in the 1960s, away from the claims based on individual guilt and individual innocence." What she was saying then was that we have to learn how to recognize institutional racism and structural racism. Now, John Hope Franklin was named the head of the commission that would organize this conversation. There were major problems from the very outset, although Franklin clearly wanted a deep engagement with the ways in which slavery and colonization had shaped the racisms that remain institutionally embedded in our societies. No indigenous person was named to the commission, and this was much more than an oversight. This meant that we would not be urged to understand the links between slavery and colonization, the ways in which the racist aggression of the post-slavery Jim Crow era was directly connected to the violent annexations of Puerto Rico and Hawaii. In fact, one of the most repressive moments in the racial history of the US took place in Wilmington, North Carolina, the Wilmington, North Carolina massacre of 1898, which means that it took place the same year that Hawaii was annexed, after, of course, the earlier overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom. Historians have reminded us that we are produced by processes that often relegate us as individuals to relative insignificance. And thinking about someone like John Hope Franklin, who was belittled by the failures of the same history of which he was a student, I feel the need to remind myself of the need for what he called a historical-minded people. He said we need more historians, but we also need a historical-minded people. And this historical mindedness, this collective consciousness that is always grounded in history, is a very important dimension of freedom. John Hope Franklin received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1995. And within a couple of months of having received this medal, he was confronted by a woman in a hotel lobby in New York who saw this black man standing there, and thought he was a custodian and gave him her garbage to dispose of. And then later he said, at a hotel in Oklahoma, he was mistaken for a bellhop and was asked to carry a stranger's luggage. So he said in an interview, I laugh at most of these people. How can you take them seriously? But later he said, you have to take them seriously. You have to take them seriously. And he said, I wish I could see what their eyes see. Here's an old man with a nice suit on, no uniform, no accoutrements of servitude. I'd like to understand what it is, Franklin says. I am 82, and they still see me as a boy. He went on to say that without ending slavery, though, and he points out that slavery should have been ended at the founding of what was called the United States of America. Without ending slavery, he said, you couldn't end the idea that black people were inferior. We have been mired by that. We have been so mired down by that ever since. Then he says, people still see me as someone meant to serve. That's a bad way to be in a country that is supposed to be based on the premise that all men are equals. The idea that all people are equal at bottom is the basis of democracy. But the notion of democracy we have been asked to accept has been a contradiction in terms. Democracy in the United States has always been an elitist democracy, an elitist version of democracy. As a consequence, the representative figure of democracy has been the affluent white male. Consequently, the measure of equality has been race and class and gender. To be equal is to be equal to not any white man, but the figure of the affluent white male. The abstract figure that is supposed to stand in for all of us. But we know that this hasn't worked because we're still struggling for freedom. Freedom is a constant struggle. But we should not neglect the regulative role that the figure of the white woman, as putatively abstract, the regulative role it has played as a stand-in for the category woman. And of course, as many scholars and activists have pointed out, existing social hierarchies even determine who gets to be a legitimate victim or a legitimate survivor of gender violence, who gets to represent those who constitute legitimate victims. Beth Ritchie has written about the every woman who peoples our imaginations, particularly with respect to the possible eruption of gender violence. And if you're familiar with the early era of the struggle against violence against women, the slogan was, every woman can be a victim. Every woman is potentially a victim of violence. But as she pointed out, this every woman figure was also raced and classed. And so we can ask, why is it so difficult to posit Black women, women of color as the exemplary figures? And so if we ask questions about the connections we make, we can say that the experiences of women of color are rich and generative, but they are only considered to be experiences that can relate to other women of color. Perhaps if it had not been assumed that we had to work with the most general of categories, and perhaps if racist hierarchies were not already internalized within that presumption of generality, we might have recognized the value of holding on to the specific and the particular. It seems to me that this is the lesson that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to impart. A century and a half after this insight should have animated our history. And what they are saying is that if Black lives mattered, then all lives would matter. If Native Hawaiian women's lives mattered, then all lives would matter. I've just referred to a text that the students in our seminar read last week. Yeah, and I see some of you are here. You recognize the text. Yesterday we were discussing the courses on American punishment, from the penitentiary to the prison industrial complex. Okay. I have to get the exact title right from Robert. American punishment from the penitentiary to the prison industrial complex. So yesterday we were talking about the way in which the development of women's prisons teaches us something very different about the way the punishment system functions. Even though women constitute a relatively small minority of people in prison all over the world, the insight we garner by looking at women's prisons far surpasses the quantity, the smallness of the quantity. And so I think we were talking about women of color, trans women of color in prison, and the insights about the entire apparatus that are acquired as a result of focusing on what appears to be a relatively small population. And we were pointing out that when women's prisons were introduced in the US, and this was in the 1870s, in 1873, the first women's prison opened in Indiana, that these places for women were reformatories. They were places where women criminals could be rehabilitated. But now, of course, the penitentiary was supposed to be a space of rehabilitation and reform. But for the men, it was, and I would have to say white men, not Native men, not Black men. But the ideological premise was that these places would allow men to reflect on their actions and to reform themselves and become better citizens. As a matter of fact, the institution of the prison is a quintessentially democratic institution. It is an institution that is only conceivable under conditions of democracy where rights and liberties are recognized in the larger population, because the role of the prison is to divest people of those rights, and you cannot be divested of something that you have not already acquired, and democracy is required. Well, anyway. But the point is that women were not considered to be citizens. So women's prisons emerged as a result of feminist activism as places where women criminals could be rehabilitated into better wives and mothers. Because this was the era of the cult of true womanhood, right? However, what is interesting is that those women who went to prison did not tend to be from the middle classes. They did not tend to be bourgeois women who would have the opportunity to be full-time wives and mothers. They were poor women. They were working women. And so what this meant was that the women's prisons reformed women criminals by transforming them into domestic servants. Because as they learned how to be better wives and mothers, they were actually learning the skills of domestic work. until the 1980s and the booming prison economy associated with deindustrialization and the dismantling of the welfare state. See Bill Clinton, just for the parentheses. Until that period, women's prison architecture even reflected this domestic approach. Now, we know that the over-incarceration practices in the US have led to the imprisonment of more people than anywhere else in the world, more in absolute numbers and more per capita. The United States has 25% of the entire planet's incarcerated population, but only 5% of the population at large. Now, when one looks at women, it's interesting that the more than 200,000 women in US prisons, and in the 1970s, there were approximately 200,000 people in prisons. So Robert was talking about the tenfold increase from the 70s to the present. But the 200,000 women in prison today constitute 1/3 of the entire documented female prison population in the world. The countries that have the next highest women's prison population are China. China has 84,600 women in prison, and Russia with 59,000. And of course, we could continue to talk about what this mass incarceration means, this over-incarceration in the context of a prison industrial complex. And we would also have to talk about Hawaii. And we would have to talk about the fact that private prison companies have offered possibilities for incarcerating people arrested here in Hawaii in small towns a small town in the state of Arizona. So isn't it bizarre that there are 2 prisons in this small town in Arizona called Inouye that hold primarily Hawaiian prisoners? Well, I understand there's also a controversy now surrounding the building of a new jail in Oahu, and that CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, which runs the 2 prisons in Inouye, Arizona, is trying to convince the government here to invest in a new private jail. But I also understand that there are people who are introducing new strategies, a new vocabulary. We're talking about decarceration as opposed to incarceration. I would say that I hope the latter group wins out. Yes. I think that it is important methodologically, whether one is conducting research or whether one is involved in activism, to produce a broad framework that consists of an acknowledgement of a range of connections. And it is within that broad framework that one can begin to explore or act against specific, act around specific kinds of issues. And I was talking about gender violence before. If one separates domestic violence or intimate violence or sexual violence from state violence, then from the very outset, one is ruling out the possibility that there might be some kind of connection, some kind of symbiosis that leads state violence, that links state violence and individualized violence, that links the violence that is so embedded in the prison apparatus and the violence that happens within intimate relationships. Which leads me to say a few words about feminism. And you know, I know that there are some feminists who can't understand why the younger generation does not accept the feminism of their grandmothers. And I'm not going to mention any names here. Maybe afterwards. But I think we're witnessing the emergence of a much more complex, complicated, productive feminism that is being embraced by many people, regardless of their gender identification, regardless of regardless of the way in which they identify into certain racialized communities. And I would like to think that this new feminism is related to what you might call abolition feminism. I have written about abolition democracy, which I have discussed in connection with the W.E.B. Du Bois's notion that democracy as we know it in this country today is lacking what would have occurred had in the aftermath of slavery or during the struggle against slavery, abolition democracy been acknowledged as a more substantive democracy, as a democracy that would have been made anew, not the democracy of the American Revolution that was built on colonization and slavery, but it would be a new democracy, new institutions that would have allowed for the incorporation of former slaves and a democracy that would have acknowledged the sovereignty of indigenous people. But that democracy didn't happen. That was the abolition democracy. And so today, I think we might begin to speak about abolition feminism. Abolition feminism as opposed to what you might call carceral feminism. A feminism that relied on punitive solutions, that relied on the state. But this is not so much about making violence against women figure into a preordained abolitionist framework. It's about demonstrating that punitive solutions, which are rarely solutions, rarely, even the punitive behavior of parents toward the child. They're rarely solutions. And these punitive solutions cannot help us imagine a world without violence, a world beyond violence. And abolition encourages us to think beyond retribution, beyond vengeance, beyond the carceral, toward ways of perhaps ultimately depositing gender violence into the dustbin of history. And I think this should be an important democratic ideal. how do we rid our worlds of the gender violence that has wrought such havoc within our families and our communities. And I would also like to point to the way increasing acceptance of ideologies of Islamophobia have had a detrimental impact on more productive forms of anti-racism, but also on our ability to fight back against gender violence. During the last years, there has been an intensification of overt anti-immigrant racism, unabashed Islamophobia, violent anti-Muslim racism associated with the so-called war on terror, and even the president himself, even as his military policies have served to accelerate material and ideological assaults against Muslims, even he was subject to and continues to be subject to Islamophobic speculations about his birth and religious affiliations. I think he was born here, right? But during the same period, we've witnessed the impact of the Patriot Act, the justification of terror, and the proliferation of prisons in service of the so-called war on terror. The most profitable sector of the prison industrial complex is now immigrant detention. And at the same time, we've seen the intensification of attacks by the Israeli government on the West Bank and Gaza. It is not accidental, it seems to me, that young people began to speak out against white supremacy and racism precisely as Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism were becoming increasingly apparent. The use of the war on terror, and this, I'm reading an op-ed that I wrote not long ago for The Guardian, I believe. The use of the war on terror as a broad designation of the project of 21st century Western democracy has served as a justification of anti-Muslim racism. It has further legitimized the Israeli occupation of Palestine. It has redefined the repression of immigrants and indirectly led to the militarization of local police departments throughout the country. Police departments, including on college and university campuses, have acquired military surplus from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan through the Department of Defense excess property program. Thus, in response to the police killing of Michael Brown, demonstrators challenging racist police violence were confronted by police officers dressed in camouflage uniforms, armed with military weapons and driving armored vehicles. Thus, it is impossible, it seems to me, to understand racism of the first decades of the 21st century without recognizing its articulation with the torture and the military assaults and the ideological dimension of the so-called war on terror. Although we tend to imagine Islamophobia in the form of state and perhaps extra-legal violence and state terror against men who practice Islam or men who appear to be Muslims, as they are representationally produced to be terrorists, and not only in European countries like France and Belgium, but also in the US by such figures as, such people as some of the current political candidates. But it is Muslim women, and especially those who wear the hijab, who become the most visible targets of a range of violences. In France, the hijab has been declared illegal in public schools under the principle of secularity, or what they call in France, laïcité. And this is putatively for the purpose of emphasizing the separation of church and state and achieving the assimilation of minorities. But we can talk about the suburbs of Paris, the banlieue, and we can talk about the state of education and the state of employment, and that certainly doesn't appear to point to assimilation. In the United States, there's the case of the Palestinian-American activist Rasmia Odeh, which reveals the way state violence produces and reproduces gender violence. And I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the case of Rasmia Odeh in Chicago. She is a 68-year-old American of Palestinian origins who was recently arrested because she had apparently answered questions regarding her history with respect to arrests inaccurately. You always get asked, have you ever been convicted? That's the box that we're trying to get rid of anyway, for universities, for jobs, and also for citizenship. She eventually received her citizenship. But as a result of the fact that she was an activist in her community, and particularly in relation to the boycott, sanctions, and divestment campaign, she was arrested and charged with answering incorrectly on a naturalization application, and therefore she was threatened with having her citizenship taken from her and threatened with deportation, not to her original home, but to Jordan. I mention this because she did not answer the question because of the horrendous sexual torture she had experienced when she was arrested. She was subject to physical torture, sexual torture, and some of it was perpetrated in front of her father, who is now deceased. So there is a major campaign around in Chicago and other parts of the U.S. To save her life and to prevent her deportation. And I'll say this afternoon, I had the opportunity to meet two really exciting and enthusiastic students from Birzeit University who are participating in a tour, the Right to Education, R2E tour. And some of you were present, I think. It was an amazing event, wasn't it? And you can follow them online. This tour is also organized by Black for Palestine, the efforts to bring Black communities and Palestinian communities in struggle together. Now let me conclude. I know I've been speaking too long. But let me say that this is a particular historical conjuncture. And at moments such as this moment, we embrace new possibilities we were once afraid to acknowledge. But at the same time, there are signs that we could move in a backwards direction. On the one hand, there appears to be a new consensus against mass incarceration. People everywhere are talking about the prison issue. People here in Hawaii are aware, am I right? There's this new collective consciousness. And let me say that 20 years ago, nobody wanted to talk about, well, there were some, and probably a lot of you, but most people didn't. But on the one hand, there appears to be this new consensus against mass incarceration and against police brutality, police violence, and young people, especially young people of color, especially young Black people and young Black women, and especially young Black queer women, are taking the lead in struggles against racist state violence. And now there is an emphasis on connections, on intersectionality, which largely comes from feminist influences on current struggles. I've been speaking about feminism, but I want to be clear that the feminism I'm speaking about is not the feminism that that Hillary Clinton speaks about. Because the feminism I'm speaking about is also anti-capitalist. And there are deep connections between anti-capitalism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and the struggle against gender violence and gender equality. And what's so exciting about all of these new movements is that they recognize the importance of this anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, anti-racist feminism. And they take seriously the importance of developing an analysis of capitalism and recognizing the connections with the attack on labor. And they see racism within an intersectional framework. Anti-Black racism requires an understanding of anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Latino, anti-Asian racisms, and especially now of anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. And one should also recognize the connection between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But also of other forms of repression, anti-immigrant repression, misogyny, ableism, homophobia, transphobia. And these new movements recognize that no struggle for freedom can be complete without an internationalist context. Thus, the connections with the movements for justice in Palestine. New models of leadership are emerging. And I emphasize the Black queer women's leadership, Black trans leadership, not for identitarian reasons, but rather because this kind of collective leadership can help extricate us from assimilationalist frameworks and objectives, can keep us radical. And finally, movements are recognizing the importance of incorporating routines of self-care into our struggles. We cannot work ourselves to death with no thought about how we're going to continue. If we destroy ourselves, we will suffer and our movements will suffer. So learning how to care for the self, for our bodies, for our spirits, for our imaginations, eating well, which requires us to popularize critiques of capitalist, industrialized, food production, the destruction of ancient seeds, capitulation to Monsanto, critiques of the violence inflicted on animals for the sole purpose of producing food for profit, which at the same time damages the health of those who eat it. But this is just the beginning of a very long story. Freedom is a constant struggle. Thank you.